Hi, I'm Heather from Heather Handmade. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to teach you how to make the upcycled blazer sewing pattern. So I have a free pattern for the 12-month size. That's this one. This is what I'm going to be demonstrating in the video. The free pattern has a version of both a notched collar, which is this, and a shawl collar, which is like this, where it's just kind of smooth on the, like a smooth curve on the outer edge. And then there is the bigger pattern that is from sizes 18 months to size 10 with everything in between. So that's 10 sizes. It has a cropped length, which is like just above the hip, and then a classic length, which is like below the length. Like think of a men's suit jacket, that is a classic length, that's what it is. It also has the shawl collar and the notch collar. The pattern is on sale for 1 week only. It will be on sale until April 13th. It is 20% off. So you can get the free version, the 12-month version, for free. I developed this pattern when my son, who is almost 11, when he was little, and it was just a way to make a suit jacket from like an adult men's suit jacket. So I kind of had a free pattern, but there was some things that needed to be fixed and perfected. So I have since gone back and fixed it and perfected it, and you can make this adorable little, like, this is just the cutest tiny little blazer. Let me show you some of the jackets I've made. So I made this. This is the largest size. This is a size 10 for my son, and I used a men's suit jacket. It still has pockets, has the shawl collar. My son's favorite part is that there's like all of the other pockets on the inside. From the original, it has 2 buttons and buttonholes that you don't have to do. You're reusing those from the original jacket. This one is also a size 10. It is the notched collar. I was practicing the notched collar. This is the cropped version. This is almost like a military length, I would say. Like I think I want to make one of these for my son, like from a military jacket, the one that has like the buttons that go down the lapel like this. That is the length I would say. It does not look like, when my son puts it on, it doesn't look like a classic suit jacket. I made this one. This is a size 7 for my daughter. This has the shawl collar. It originally was a double-breasted jacket, so I kind of had to reuse 2 buttons because of the buttonholes that were there, but I think it turned out great. This is the cropped version. We kept the pockets. My daughter loves it. And then I just wanted to show you, this one was when I was still developing the pattern, so it doesn't have either a shawl collar or a notched collar because I was still working on it. But I did want to show that this original jacket did not have lining, so it is possible to make this from a suit jacket or a blazer that doesn't have a lining. You just kind of do like skip the lining steps, and you can still make the whole jacket. In this video, I will show you how to cut it out, because you are cutting out specific parts of the jacket and you need to line up the pattern in specific places. So I'll show you how to cut it out, and then I'll show you how to sew it together and get the hems and everything looking nice. So let's get started. For this project, you are going to need a suit jacket. You can use a men's or a women's suit jacket. They both work. There are some differences in the way that men's and women's jackets are made, but this pattern will work with almost all of them. It needs to have a lapel and a collar, sleeves, and then, you know, there's going to be different details on the front, like pockets or buttons. There's going to be buttons on the sleeves, and most of those we can kind of work with the pattern. You will also need the pattern. You can either get the free 12-month size on my blog, or you can purchase the pattern that is size 18 months through size 10. In this video, I'm going to be using the 12-month size to work with this jacket, but the techniques and the method is the exact same for all of the sizes. The pattern comes with both a notched collar version and a shawl collar version. In this video, I'm going to be demonstrating the notched collar because it is harder. So the first thing we're going to do with our jacket is undo the buttons and open it up. And what we're going to do is we are going to cut on the sides, open up the side seams so that we can lay it out flat and it's easier to do our pattern pieces. When you look at a jacket, This is both men's and women's, where there's the pockets kind of on the front side that goes through a seam like this, and then there is a side back seam behind it that doesn't have anything go through it, and it goes up to the sleeve. This is the back seam that we are going to cut through. You do not want to cut through these pockets because then you will lose the pockets. And our front piece, almost all blazers are made where there's more room in the front, and the side seam, like where the side seam would be right under the sleeve, there is no seam there, but that makes it so we are more likely to get a pocket. So take this back seam and we're just going to cut through the seam to open up the jacket. Get up to the sleeve, and then on the sleeve I actually want to cut through this underarm seam. I kind of cut down through here in the seam to get to this other sleeve seam, and then I cut through this sleeve seam just like this. I'm cutting through both the lining and the outer fabric. Then do the same to the other side. So I've placed the front of the jacket wrong sides together. Essentially, I've just laid it down so that both of the fronts are laying perfectly on top of each other, so that when I cut something out, I will have a mirrored piece. So you take your piece, and the most important thing is that you see this line. This is the lapel fold line. This is the guide. And when you have a jacket, a lot of times there's like some tailoring and stuff that's done in here to make that lapel fold at the right place. So we're going to line up that fold the best we can. You also want to pay attention to where these buttons and buttonholes are, because you want to save them and use them again. So this lapel fold line goes down to here. This is kind of where it starts. So I'm actually going to place the pattern kind of down here like this. It's actually right up against the edge. I don't always get it to be like that, but that's just sometimes how it works. This front edge will be finished with bias binding, so it's not a huge deal. Check your buttons. I actually want this. I want this top button to be kind of at the bottom of this fold line, just like this. And then you come over and you check your pockets. So this jacket has these pockets with, it's a pocket with a fold. And since this is a small, the smallest version, I'm only going to get like half of the pocket, and it's going to be in this seam when I cut that through, which is just fine. I do that a lot. It's going to be the same on the other side. That doesn't bother me. If you have a bigger size, it will fit a little bit, you know, more like this, and it will come wider, so then you can get more pocket. This is just a great way to be able to reuse a pocket. The other thing you can check is on the other side. This is the front left side of the jacket. There's often like a chest pocket, and this, when I feel like this pattern is not going to use the chest pocket. It's going to cut through it. So I'm just going to take it out once I cut through it. Some of the other versions I've done, the pattern piece was higher, and the chest pocket kind of ended up going into the sleeve seam. So I'm going to pin this on and then cut it out. Now we're going to do the same for the collar, since this is already folded nicely, and you have the same thing with the collar, where this is kind of a collar fold guideline, and you have this collar, this is where it folds, because you kind of this line is going to go into that lapel fold line. We're going to place our collar on here. You want to match up with the fold. Do your best to match up with the fold line. Pin this on and then cut it out. Since you're doing all these layers, you're going to be cutting out your upper collar and your under collar at the same time. Now we're going to cut out the back, and you can feel there's kind of like some shoulder pads in here, which you're going to find with all jackets. Some, even the men's jackets, have kind of like chest pads. So it just feels really like bulky. So we're going to place the back piece. This is not a fold line, this is a seam. So you don't have to line it exactly up with the back like for a fold, but you're just going to kind of place it on like this. I am not going to keep the vent. You can try to keep the vent if you want. I find it's a little tricky to get the vent to look good because I don't have you do it the traditional method with like a mitered corner. So if you know how to do that, then you can keep the vent yourself. Now we're going to cut out the back piece. Last thing we're going to do is the sleeve. If you have a women's jacket, women's buttonholes are always cut through, so you need to make sure all the buttons are buttoned up. If it's a men's jacket, they don't cut through the buttons, so it's not as big of a deal. So you're gonna place your sleeve just right here along the bottom like this. And you want, this is the back of the sleeve with the 2 notches. This is the front of the sleeve. You want the notches to be like in the back. If you cut your sleeve into 2 halves, you want it to be in the middle of the back half. You know that those buttons are just like right here on your sleeve. So I'm going to pin this on and then cut it out. So you're cutting out the 2 outer fabric layers and the 2 lining layers. Now that everything's cut out, you're actually going to go through and check if there's any like pieces that are falling out. You come in, check. So this is all interfaced, which is great. When you have a men's jacket, there's often some extra padding like in tailoring in here. So I often cut that out. I'm checking for any pieces like this that I don't just want hanging around that's kind of in the way. When you're working with the collars, you actually need them to be separate. So I'm just going to go through and seam rip this. So now you have your 2 collar pieces. You can see this has kind of that nice fold. Here is part of the shoulder pads that got into the seam, so I'm taking that out. I'm also taking out this seam allowance, and you can see that this piece of lining was a little bit wrinkled, so I'm going to straighten that out. So as you can see, let me open this up so you can see better. This is how the lining got cut out. So I'm going to take off this tag and this tag. There's often a pleat in the back of the lining of a jacket, so I'm just going to seam rip this and cut this out, and then I'm going to separate this. This was part of the seam, so I just need to cut through there. Then the last thing we're going to do is check the sleeves, and there's not usually anything in the sleeves that I have to take out. Sometimes I have to remove some side seams, but often what happens is that the lining is just bigger after you cut it out. So I just go through and I trim the lining down to match the size of the sleeve. First thing we're going to do is we are going to sew the back seam. So you're going to place the back seam right sides together and pin that, and then we're going to do the same to the lining. So we're going to sew both of these seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. You're going to backstitch when you start and when you stop. So now you're going to press both of these seams open. Now we're going to sew the shoulder seams and the side seams together. The back pieces, the lining and the blazer fabric is separate, but in the front it's connected by either like the buttonhole or the buttons. So you're going to sew them together, but it's going to feel all kind of bundled up together. So this is the right side of the jacket, and this is the right side of the jacket. I'm pulling the lining into the middle so it's kind of out of the way. Make sure that these pockets stay in the right place. It's all lining up. It's over here too. So I'm going to be doing these seams with the back, and I'm going to pin it all right sides together. Then I'm going to pin the sides together, paying attention to the pockets so I can pin the pockets in the right place. So now we're going to sew these side seams up to the sleeve and these shoulder seams with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and backstitch when you start and when you stop. We're going to do the same for the lining. It's just a little bit harder to see because this has already been pinned, but we're going to, this is the right side of the lining matched up with the right side of this lining. So pin it to the shoulders and the side seams, and we're going to do the same where you sew the sides within 1/2 inch seam allowance and you backstitch when you start and when you stop. Now we're going to work on the collar. So you're going to come to this front section. If you look, this is on the front piece. There is this curve right here. It's on both this outer and this lining piece. So you're going to take some scissors, and if you are nervous, you can mark 1/2 inch in at this curve. So I'm just going to clip in. You're only going to clip in about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch into that seam allowance. You don't want to cross where that seam is going to go, and it's just to make it so it will be easier to put the collar in. So I'm just going to make 3 little clips so that that will almost makes it so you can pull it straight for when you insert the collar. Now I'm going to do the other side. So now we're going to put the collar in, and it feels weird because when you put the collar in, you're going to, this is the under collar. You can see that it folds this way and the right side is like the bottom, and that's going to actually go on the outer fabric, like the outer blazer, and then the collar that it folds towards the inside, and you want this to be the top. This is going to be on the lining, so that when it's all folded together, this is the one that shows, and then this is the one that does the support and gives strength to the collar. So with right sides together, we are going to pin this collar to the lining and then the under collar to the blazer fabric. So I'm going to find the center back. You might have marked that when you cut it out, and pin it to the center back of the jacket. Then you're going to come out and there's this curve. So this point right here, this is the point that is going to line up 1 inch from the edge of the lapel right here. So I'm going to pin that in place, and then I'm going to pin in the middle. So this where I cut is kind of where it goes around this curve of this collar. It makes it easier to sew that curve in place because it's opposing curves. Then do the same to the other side. Then we're going to use the same steps to do the under collar. Now we're going to sew both of these collars in with 1/2 inch seam allowance, and make sure you back stitch when you start and when you stop. You're going to have to feel both the top and the bottom as you go, so you don't get any tucks or gathers in the fabric where it's kind of moved. Since you're going around these corners, it makes it a little bit trickier. The collars are sewn in, so now I'm going to press this seam open, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to, since you're pressing it open, you can see that like on this side there is too much fabric because the fabric is going from a curve in, and so I'm going to notch here, and then I'm going to clip to make sure that these clips are, you know, spreading enough so that they can lie flat. Then I'm going to just do a couple clips throughout the whole collar so that it will be able to lie flat, since this is a rounded neckline in here for all of this. So now this part is a little tricky to show, but see how this neckline is open and it's flat, and we want to keep it that way once we put all the layers together. So this is also open and flat. So what you're going to do is we are going to match up. It's like we're matching up these two necklines so that the seam is matching, so that when the whole collar is together, we want this to match up nicely. So to keep that together, so do you see how these seam allowances are open and then laying against each other? So I'm going to take just one side of the seam allowance of the top, the upper collar and the under collar, and I'm holding them together. You can pin them together, and you're going to sew this seam allowances together, like between the shoulder seams, you're just gonna kind of baste across those 2 seam allowances, and that's going to keep everything in place and like keep the necklines open, so it helps reduce the bulk right there at the collar. So now when you fold that collar up, then you have a nice collar that this seam is just way less bulky because we've, you know, made it stay flat and open. So the next thing we are going to do is we are going to do the hem. So you're going to turn the jacket right side out. You can do it through an armhole or through one of the spaces that has not been finished. So the blazer fabric, this is longer, this is 1 inch longer all along the bottom. The lining is shorter, that's how it was cut out with the pattern. And that will make it so this eventually will fold up better. So we're going to match, it's like you're pulling this down to meet the longer fabric, and match up all of your seams and pin them right sides together. These seam allowances should be pressed open before you pin it together. You can see that on the lining. I forgot to do that. And then you're going to come over, and it's not going to go all the way to this curve. It's only going to go partway into this front facing, and you just, it's going to end right here where that notch is. So now we're going to sew, if we flip it over, we're going to sew from this notch across to this notch. You're not going to be sewing at 1 inch, you're going to be sewing at 1/2 inch all the way across, and backstitch when you start and when you stop. Before we turn this right side out, we're going to do some extra tacking to help this hem stay in place. So most of the time in like professional jackets, they actually hand stitch, but this is just kind of a shortcut method that's not as hard. So this hem is 1 inch. So if you go up 1 inch, that is where your hem is going to fold. So it's going to be like this in the end, like when you turn it right side out, with these are the wrong sides together. So you're going to fold that in place. Then you're going to take 2 of these seam allowances, and you're only working with like this tiny bit. You're not going to have a lot of room for like movement to play with it, but I'm pinning this, and I'm just going to do like 2 stitches forward, 2 stitches back to hold this together. It doesn't need to be a long stitch, it just needs to hold that together so that the hem can stay together once it's turned right side out. And you're going to do it to these other seams too. Once that hem is done, you're going to turn it right side out. So before I iron this flat, if you look at this seam, so this hem is going up, and this part, this is like the lining part, this wants to come down. it's tucked up in here. So I'm just going to clip into this seam. Clip into the seam allowance. This is like the facing the lining part. So if I do that, this makes it so this can lie flat, this can come tucked out, and this can be tucked in. So do that to both sides. Now I'm going to press that hem in place. So you can see, if you feel this is like stuck where I tacked it, I can't like pull the hem down. So that makes it so we have a nice crisp fold. Now I'm going to pin all the front layers together, especially right here at the collar. You want all the edges to line up nicely. Pin all the way around so that you can baste it, so it will be easier to put on bias binding. Then come to the armholes and pin all of this together and baste it together so we can treat it as one layer. One thing, when you are here at this front, place together like this, but this is kind of some extra seam allowance. So you're going to come where you like stopped sewing, and you've already pressed that open so you know where the seam allowance is. And we're just going to cut this little 1 inch of seam allowance off at the lapel, and that will reduce the bulk right there. So do that there's 4 different places that you need to do that. Now we're going to prepare the sleeves. So when you open it up, you can see some of it is attached like to the lining, and you want that to stay. We're not going to unpick that. Sometimes there is some stitching right here to keep this hem up here like this. So then I often have to do some unpicking right here just so I can open the hem right here at this side seam. This hem does not have that. You usually find that in men's jackets and not in women's. So what you're going to do is we're just going to fold the entire side seam together from, the lining and the blazer fabric. Make sure that you match up the fold line. Then we're going to sew along here with a 1/2 inch seam allowance and back stitch when you start and when you stop. Now before we turn the sleeves right side out, we're going to do the same thing how we tacked the hem on the bottom of the jacket. This hem has already been kind of ironed in place, if you can feel it. It's weird because this is connected. So this is the fold right here. So I'm going to fold it on that fold line, and I'm only matching up this seam allowance, and I'm going to just sew like a 1/2 inch tack down and back to hold that in place, and that's going to keep the sleeve hem folded at the right place. So do that to both sleeve hem seam allowances. So turn your sleeve right side out, or really just kind of push the lining to the inside of the sleeve. Oh, and I forgot to mention, you should press your seam allowance open before you do this. So now you have this nice sleeve, and it's going to stay folded right here at the right place. So now you're going to go to the top of the sleeve, and you're going to match up all of these edges and notches and seams, pin them together, and we're going to baste it all together so that we can treat the sleeve, the 2 layers, as 1 layer. Now I'm going to add an easing stitch. It's going to go from this notch to these 2 back notches back here. I'm not going to go into much detail about how to do the easing stitch, but you need to ease the top of this sleeve so that it will fit into this jacket. I have a video which you can see here. It goes into depth, and it has 2 different ways to sew a set-in sleeve by easing. So now we're going to put the sleeves in the jacket. So the easiest way to do that is you open the jacket, you look at it from the lining, and then you find this is the front notch, these are the back notches. So this sleeve is going to go on this side. So when I'm looking at it from the lining of the jacket, and I'm looking in towards almost like the lining of the sleeve, and this is the easiest way to pin it together and then sew it together. So this bottom seam of the sleeve is going to match with this bottom notch of the armhole of the jacket. So pin that together. Then this top notch right here matches up with this seam, this shoulder seam at the top of the jacket. So pin that together, and make sure you're kind of looking at the lining and the lining, and that's so that the jacket, the blazer fabric, is right sides together. And then since we've eased that seam or that sleeve, it just kind of fits nicely into the jacket armhole. So pin these layers together all the way around the armhole. And then we're going to do the same to this sleeve over here. So now you're going to sew around both of the armholes with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and you just have a lot of layers, so just kind of go slow so that everything can stay together. Once you have finished sewing the sleeve in, you can finish the seam allowance with either serge it, you can zigzag it, or you can even finish it with bias binding. Now, the last thing we have to do, you can see the jacket looks pretty much done, is we just need to finish this front edge and around the collar. So I have pre-made purchase bias binding. This is a double fold, 1/2 inch wide. Now, if you remember down here, we have this kind of little opening between, like for the hem. So you're gonna start just like 1/4 inch past that with the bias binding, and then go all the way around. I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail because there's lots of different tutorials about how to do like inner corners and outer corners. But I do recommend that you do not just sew the bias binding on, like fold it around and then sew it on. I do recommend that you open it all the way up and sew one side and then fold it over and sew the other side. I like to start on the inside and you fold the short end like this, and then you come, just past that hole in the hem, and then you start sewing all the way around till you get to the other side, and then when you end, you're going to end with the same fold on the short end, just like this. So I've sewn the bias binding all the way on. I have done these, then we'll flip it over and sew it all the way on. Once you have the bias binding on, give everything a really good press, and your blazer is now finished. And that's how you make the upcycled blazer sewing pattern. I can't wait to see all of the blazers that you make. Please share them with me on social media. Check out these playlists of upcycled sewing projects and all of the videos of my free sewing patterns. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope you have a wonderful day.